Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here's the first lecture, Chapter 1 of this semester. Before I continue with Chapter 1, let me give you a little disclaimer. First of all, I'm not really set up to do online classes entirely, but I have to now because of the pandemic going on. I'm 64 years old, just turned that a week or so ago, and I'm getting ready to retire, so I'm just trying to do the best I can with this online stuff before I retire. I like to lecture. I think I give pretty decent lectures. At least that's what students have told me in the past. So in moving to online classes, at least temporarily, I'm wanting to continue to lecture. And I'm hoping that you like this part of the class. I admit these lectures are going to be long. They may be boring at times. I tend to be a little wordy. I tend to sometimes talk a little slow. Other times I talk a little fast. Sometimes I don't talk real clearly. Anyway, we're going to struggle through this, going to do the best we can. I hope it works out for you. Let me mention first of all that when I lecture in class face to face, I usually don't give a lot of definitions and a lot of details. I think that's what the book is for. So get the book, read the book, study it. And I have chapter study questions in Canvas. It's the second item in each module in Canvas. Take a look at those so that you know what to study for in the book, and when in preparation for the quizzes and the tests, mainly the tests, and what you need to know specifically in lectures for the quizzes and the tests. Anyway, I don't like to define a whole lot and give a lot of details. That's what the book is for. But I do like to define psychology on day one in the beginning, mainly to create a little bit of discussion, which we would have a little bit of if we were in class face to face. But I'll just try to do the best I can, kind of in a one-sided sort of discussion format. First of all, I do like to define psychology, so that's what we'll do right now. I would say there's 3 or 4 major components of the definition of psychology. First of all, it's a science. So somewhere in the textbook, or maybe some textbooks that I've used, if it's not yours, there is the quote from a famous psychologist from years and years ago that goes like this: psychology has a long past but a short history. So what does that mean? The long past of psychology probably began as soon as humans had the ability to think about themselves and to think about each other and ask questions like, why did I do that? Why did that person do that? What makes that person tick? Those are the kinds of questions that psychologists have long answered, and we have been asking them ever since the beginning of our ability to think. So there's a huge past of psychology, but the short history of psychology is when we brought that in the laboratory, or at least started using laboratory type procedures called the scientific method to help us to arrive at truth and get beyond our biases and our preconceptions and the typical sort of ineffective and unscientific means of determining whether what we thought was true really is true. So in the everyday behavior that we engage in with other people, we're constantly making judgments of other people. We're constantly being armchair psychologists. But many of our judgments, not most of them necessarily, but many of our judgments tend to be incorrect. They tend to be biased, and they're not very scientific. Along those lines, when I tell people I'm a psychologist, they usually think 2 things about me. The first thing they think is that I'm a therapist, and as we'll talk about at the very end of this chapter, many people who go into psychology aren't therapists at all. About half of all psychologists who go into psychology are not trained in therapy, and I'm one of those. So it's understandable that many people would believe I'm a psychologist when they first, that I'm a therapist when they first meet me, but it's simply not true. The second thing that they think about me commonly is that I'm analyzing them, and the truth is that I am. Everybody analyzes everybody else. That's the long past of psychology, but we don't do it very scientifically. So psychology, the discipline of psychology, is a scientific endeavor to analyze other people, to understand what makes people do what they do, and understand all the factors that influence their behavior and their mental processes in a way that gives us truth. So if I had to summarize the scientific method, and you can read about it in your book, if I had to summarize scientific method in 3 words, it would be the systematic observations in order to test hypotheses. Did I say 3 words? More than 3 words. It's a series of systematic observations designed to test hypotheses. And through these systematic observations, we're trying to get rid of the biases that normally occur when we're playing armchair psychologists and analyzing other people and including ourselves. All right, so first and foremost, psychology is a science. Now, I should mention something else before I leave this part of the definition. When I was an undergraduate, one of my professors quoted Shakespeare, Macbeth, and I'm probably going to mess it up a little bit, something like, me thinketh a lady doth protest too loudly. Lady Macbeth was complicit in the murder of somebody else. I can't even remember. Some of you are probably going, I know that story. He's murdering it. No pun intended. Anyway, she's really guilty, at least partially, for the murders of somebody. And she's constantly denying it, washing her hands to absolve herself of the guilt. And so that leads the people around her, at least somebody around her, to say that maybe she's denying it so much and making such a big deal about her being innocent that maybe in fact it's a defense mechanism and she actually is guilty. So anyway, my psych professor way back when said that that's kind of the way psychologists are. We're constantly trying to tell other people that we're a science. Maybe that's because we feel guilty that we're actually not. But I just want to point out that we are a science, and we're a science because we engage in the scientific method. We use those systematic methods to test our hypotheses. You could even argue that a discipline, psychology or whatever, if a discipline used the scientific method in order to ask questions that were pertinent to its discipline, but were never able to come up with any solid answers to those questions, we would still be a science. Science is not based on the outcome. It's based on the process. And psychologists engage in the process. Now, I want to point out that there's a lot of pseudo-psychology out there. Much of that pseudo-psychology doesn't use the scientific method. And it gets confused with psychology a lot, unfortunately. Many people know psychology through the pseudo-psychological things that get published in the media and the things that people talk about in conversations with each other. And I think that's a shame. But the part of psychology that is really a science is the science that we're going to study this semester, and it definitely is a science because of the process that we use. Now, the second part of the definition of psychology is that it's about humans. Now, you might argue that we study dogs. Ivan Pavlov studied dogs. We study dolphins. We study birds. We study rats, pigeons. Many famous psychologists have studied other species, and so it can't be just about humans, right? And that's true, but the reason why we study humans is the reason why we study these other species is to understand humans, and that's the reason why the word human is in the definition of psychology. There is much to learn about humans from rats and pigeons and dolphins and chimpanzees and dogs and cats and all sorts of other species that have been studied. And you may doubt that. like I did when I was an introductory psych student way back when, 1974. 3 actually was the first psychology I took at American River College when I was 17 years old. I don't think I understood back then that we could learn a lot about humans from these other species, but now I'm convinced. After many, many years, I know that there's many things that we can learn about humans from these other species. That's the ultimate goal, to study whatever we need to study, even computers, to understand humans better. Now, what are the 2 major things that we study in humans? The first thing that we study in humans is behavior. The second thing is mental processes. So there you have it, the current definition of psychology. It's the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. Now, I want to point out something. Behavior, the behavior part of psychology, is the more concrete and easily measurable, more easily manipulated focus of psychology. And because of those things, it's also the part of psychology that makes us more scientific. The mental processes part, which would include all those internal things, thoughts and belief systems and impressions and emotions and motivations, all those things that are harder to measure, harder to manipulate, and harder to observe scientifically and study scientifically. This makes us have a softer side of psychology. So there is the hard part of psychology, and there's the soft side of psychology. All right, we're going to talk more about that in a little bit, but let's move on to the history of psychology. Now, in your book, you'll read about paradigms of psychology and go way back before what we're going to say is the very beginning of psychology itself. It'll talk about the ancient Greeks. It may even talk about, or could talk about, the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Chinese. And it could talk about philosophy. Probably does. I know the book does talk about philosophy. Those are all kind of the underpinnings of the history of psychology. But the history of psychology, the short history of psychology, the scientific history of psychology itself, began in 1879 with a guy named Wilhelm Wundt. And if you think about it, 1879, let's do the math here, that's 21, and that's 141 years ago, right? So the beginning of scientific psychology was 141 years ago. If we're around long enough to be a discipline, a scientific discipline, 2,500 years from now, then maybe we'll be as sophisticated as a science as medicine is right now, because it's been around for 2,500 years at this point now. That's one of the reasons why psychology seems like less of a science to other people. We're a very young science. But another reason why we seem like less of a science to some people is because we do have that softer side of psychology. Now, what I want to point out is that when psychology first began, the definition of psychology probably would have been stated like this. It's the scientific study of human mental processes. So it didn't include behavior. It only included the softer side of psychology, the side of psychology that was harder to measure and manipulate and observe. And we were a science because Wilhelm Wundt used the scientific method to study thinking and reaction time, sensory processes, perception processes. Basically what he did is he put people in a lab and had them subjected to different stimuli, sounds and tastes and touches and visual stimuli, and he had them introspect and think about what they were experiencing, and then he compared what they were reporting with other people to develop a systematic understanding of how people sense and perceive the world. In some sense, he was trying to develop a structural understanding of the elements of thinking, sensation, and perception. Similar to the periodic table of elements, which includes the structural elements of the world that we live in. He was trying to do that with mental processes. And that's associated with a paradigm called structuralism, which is discussed in the book. I'm not going to ask you about structuralism on a test and who are the people involved in that, but Wilhelm Wundt was the beginning of the structuralist kind of approach to psychology. But the main point I want to make here is that he was studying mental processes. Now, that's the way psychology went for the first 40 years of its existence. And I'm going to point out here that what you're going to see here at the end is 3 distinct stages in the history of psychology. In the first 40 years of our history, we basically just studied the mind, mental processes. That all began to change in the early 1900s with Ivan Pavlov, who taught dogs to salivate to a bell, and also with John Watson. With John Watson was really the beginning of what we call behaviorism, the paradigm we'll talk about in a minute that focused on behavior. John Watson, as a rat runner, was teaching rats to run mazes and seeing how quickly they learned and what they could learn, what they couldn't. And he was using that as a basis for studying intelligence and thinking and motivation and consequences of behavior. But his goal in the long run was to use that, studying the rat in that way, to understand the human mind. And at some point he threw up his hands and he said, "This is kind of ridiculous. I think I'm understanding what's going on in the rat's mind and what the rat is motivated to do and all that kind of stuff. But the only thing I really know for certain is what the rat's doing. Everything else I think I'm understanding is just an assumption or an inference based on what I really know. In fact, the only thing I know for sure is what the rat's doing, the behavior." So maybe we just need to get away from this science of inferences and assumptions and study what we know for certain. In rats, behavior only, and in humans in particular. Let's just study behavior. If we really want to be truly respectable like the other sciences of the day, we need to study the part of our discipline that's concrete, behavior, more easily measurable, as opposed to the mental processes that we've been studying for 40 years. And a lot of people were convinced. The joke is that psychology lost its mind in 1920 or so, because psychology underwent a 180-degree shift. We shifted from studying the mind only to studying the behavior only. We study behavior only now because it was the thing that made the most sense, the thing that we could most easily study scientifically. John Watson also pointed out that I don't need to know the mind of the rat in order to control the rat's behavior. All I need to, and maybe it's through trial and error, all I need to do is find the right rewards or consequences for the rat's behavior that will act as an incentive to get the rat to engage in the behaviors that I want the behavior to engage in. And I can control the rat without knowing the mind at all. And I would argue that that's probably true about humans as well. I don't need what's going on in my wife's mind or anybody else's mind in order to get what I want out of them. And maybe it's through trial and error, maybe it's taken 43 years of marriage for me at this point to find out what really my wife likes. But I know that once I do those things, I'm more likely to get what I want out of the relationship. And the fact is that I never really know what's going on in the mind of my wife. I may think she really loves me, but maybe she's just trying to hide the affair that she's having on the side, which I don't think she's having. But you never know, right? We just don't know the mental processes of other people. The only thing we know for certain is what they do on the outside. And in the end, that's the only thing that matters. That's the emphasis of psychology from 1920 to 1960. Well, after 40 years of just studying behavior, because it was more easily done to be a science, we began to get some evidence, and you would think it would take less time than those 40 years, but we began to get some evidence that studying the mind left out an important component of human processing. Maybe this is best illustrated through something called antabuse. Antabuse is a behavioral treatment for alcoholism. If you have antabuse in your system, it interacts with the alcohol that you ingest. It makes you sick. The two make you sick, and you get so sick that you don't want to drink again. And if you keep having antabuse in your system whenever you drink alcohol, you begin to get the idea that drinking is not pleasurable at all. And so you learn not to drink. The only problem with that approach is that if behaviorists are completely correct, that the only thing that matters is what we do, not how we think, then that should work as a treatment for alcoholism. But the problem is it really doesn't work. And the reason for that, I think, is because we think somebody might reason and say, the reason why I'm sick is not because of the alcohol, it's because of the antabuse in my system. And when I get out of this court-mandated treatment program or out of this institution that I'm in, then I'm going to stop taking the antabuse, and then I'm going to enjoy the alcohol the way I used to. And of course, that completely undoes what would otherwise be a successful and an important treatment, because alcoholism is a very serious disorder. The fact is we think. You may go to a smoking cessation program where every time you get the urge to smoke, you pull the rubber band back on your wrist and let it go so that it stings, hurts it. And pretty soon you get this association in your mind that even thinking about smoking is unpleasant because it's associated with the rubber band being snapped on your wrist. The problem is, at some point, the person going through that kind of treatment is going to pull the rubber band back and go, do I really want a sore wrist or do I want to smoke? I think I'll just smoke. The fact is thinking matters. Now, another thing happened when we began to realize more and more that we need to bring thinking back into the equation. And the follow-up to the earlier joke is that in 1960 or so, psychology regained its mind because we began to realize we couldn't ignore it any longer. But the other thing that happened was technology. Now, the way that technology has gone in the last 60 years, you may think in the 1960s there was nothing that was going on back then that even remotely resembled the kind of technology we have now. And that may be true to a certain extent. But we were beginning to have technology back then that allowed us to study the mind, not through introspection like Wilhelm Wundt did way back when, but through PET scans and CAT scans and things like that. We could tell somebody to think about something, give them stimuli like touch and tastes and smells and sights and sounds like Wilhelm Wundt did, and have them tell us what they're thinking. But we can also look at their brain and we can study what their brain's doing when they're thinking. And so thinking began to be more like behavior, more concrete, which allowed it to be more scientifically studied. And it became kind of the more harder part of psychology beginning in the 1960s. And of course, that's just taken off and become even more so true today. So 3 distinct periods of psychology, the history of psychology. First of all, we studied the mind, then just behavior, and now we've studied both. And the definition of psychology is not likely going to change because there's really nothing else to study. Everything else that you could think of that we could study is basically just subsumed under the ideas of mental processing, internal processes, and external processes that are more observable, like behavior. Now, in going through this history, mentioned the word paradigm. A paradigm is a perspective or a way of thinking about something, not 20 cents, as the screen might suggest. A paradigm, in this case, answers the basic question: what is the most important thing to study if you want to understand humans psychologically? Well, behaviorists would say the most important thing to study is psychology. Behaviorists would say the most important thing to study is behavior because it's the most readily observable and manipulatable thing that we can study in humans. It's the thing that we know for certain. And they also say that the most important thing to study outside of behavior is the environment, because all behavior is caused by the environment. It's not caused by thinking. We don't think about something and then do it. We actually do something, get a consequence, and then we like that consequence. So if we like that consequence, we're more likely to do that behavior again that preceded the consequence because we see a connection between the two. There's no real thinking going on. It's all about the environment causing us to do whatever we do. Radical behaviorists like John Watson way back when believed that thinking is irrelevant, unscientific, and akin to magic and superstition and religion. That's a quote, kind of a paraphrase of a quote from John Watson. Anyway, radical behaviors sort of believe that way. It's a paradigm that was alive and well from 1920 to 1960, and it's still very much alive and well in psychology. Right. So the environment is also studied as a cause of why we do what we do. Now, the second paradigm, let me go back here. So the 5 paradigms that I'm going to emphasize that you need to know about in this chapter are behaviorism, the psychodynamic or the psychoanalytic paradigm, the humanistic paradigm, the cognitive paradigm, and the biological paradigm. So let's go back to my other slides and look at the psychodynamic paradigm. The psychodynamic paradigm is Sigmund Freud's paradigm. His emphasis in answer to the question, what's the most important thing to study if you want to understand humans? His answer is unconscious mental processes. Freud said that all of the important human psychological processes that influence what we do and what we're all about come from underneath the water, so to speak, using the iceberg analogy. In an iceberg, you have the very tip of the iceberg above the water in the ocean, but most of the iceberg is underneath the water. It's not readily detectable. For Freud, that's analogous to the unconscious part of our personality, which is the largest part of our personality and has the most input and influence on who we are. Unconscious mental processes, that's the key here. Now, a lot of people think that Freud is Mr. Psychology, the most important psychologist ever. But remember that psychology, as we're going to talk about it in this class, is a science. And to be truly scientific, you have to engage in a process that allows you to study things systematically. And it really does help, going back historically, talking about behaviorists and their role in the history of psychology. It really does help to study the hard parts of psychology, behavior, for instance, in order to be more scientific, because the hard parts of who we are, behavior, are more easily observed, more easily measured, and manipulated in studies. Freud's idea of the unconscious, you have to understand, is suggestive of something that is the opposite of behavior. If mental processes in general is hard to be scientific about when studying, then unconscious mental processes have to be doubly hard. So that's kind of a roundabout way to say that Freud has always been on the fringe of scientific psychology from the very beginning and through today. His focus of study is not really all that susceptible to scientific study. We're going to talk more about that later on, but just file that away. Mr. Psychology, the most important psychologist ever, is probably a behaviorist, not Sigmund Freud. I want to point out something else. If you go back to the history of psychology a few slides ago, nowhere did you see an emphasis on unconscious mental processes. It's always been on either behavior or conscious mental processes. So back in the day when Freud was trying to convince people that unconscious mental processes were the most important thing to study, he was competing on center stage with behaviorists, early 1900s. And guess who won? Behaviorists won. Freud was relegated to the fringes of psychology because it's really hard to be scientific about what he wanted to study. Now, it's still a paradigm that we talk about. It's still important because, like thinking way back when it wasn't considered really respectable, unconscious mental processes do happen. It is a part of who we are, and they do need to be studied. It's just that it's a tougher road to study them scientifically. All right, the third paradigm in psychology is the humanistic paradigm. Now, to understand the humanistic paradigm, you really need to understand when it began to be prominent, and this would be in the 1960s. The 1960s are also known by many of us as the hippie culture, the time when hippies had their heyday. Hippies were all about rebellion against the man, authority, tradition, societies, norms which were too restrictive on people and tended to make people something that they really weren't. So in 1960s, hippies wanted to become real, become genuine, and throw off the shackles and the restrictions of traditional traditional society and governments, and to be who we really are, and that's loving, freedom-seeking, self-actualizing, self-determining individuals. with the creative mental capacities to make the world whatever we want to make it, as opposed to make it the way society has traditionally, or governments have said, or parents have said that we should make it. So anyway, hippies were rebelling against that kind of authority thrown on them that was making them be something that they didn't feel that they really were. That was kind of negative. In psychology, humanism, the hippie culture was manifested by the humanistic paradigm. Humanists said, we're going to throw off the restrictions and the negative perspectives, the pessimism of the psychodynamic perspective and the behavioral perspective. We're going to get rid of those, and we're going to focus on the things that are true about humans in general, and that is that we're not determined by the environment, we're not determined by our unconscious mental processes. We have self-determination. We can be who and what we want to be. We have that unique capacity because we're human. Now I want to point this out, or emphasize what I just pointed out. Behaviorism and psychoanalytic paradigm may seem to be totally opposite each other, but they do have this one thing in common. They're both what philosophers would call a deterministic way of looking at humans. In the extreme, behaviorists believe that humans are machines that are programmed by the environment. And in the extreme as well, psychodynamic or psychoanalytic psychologists believe that we're animals programmed by our instincts, our animalistic instincts, things like our sex drive and our aggression drive. Those things kind of preclude the possibility that we can determine our own destinies. Humanists said, no, we don't believe in the pessimism of those traditional paradigms. We're going to get rid of them and focus on the human potential, our ability to self-choose our outcomes and be who and what we want to be. Now, that paradigm is still alive in psychology. It's not a hugely, it's not a really large perspective in psychology that dominates a lot of research and a lot of theories. I think the reason for that is because it's fairly abstract, it's fairly subjective. It's a little bit like thinking in general way back when, and it's also like unconscious mental processes. It's hard to be scientific with a study of human potential and the self-determination, free will. Those are kind of abstract concepts that can be studied behaviorally and concretely. But when you start to study it behaviorally and concretely, then you get into other paradigms of psychology. And so at the heart of humanism is something that's really not really all that scientific. And so I would say that, like most hippies who grew up and became practical and became your parents, grandparents, and lawyers and doctors and dentists and McDonald's managers, humanistic psychologists have sort of, in order to survive in psychology, have needed to become practical in their applications. And the biggest application of humanistic psychology today is in therapy, probably, where humanistic therapists get their clients to understand that they are people of worth no matter what, even if their parents and other people have conditionally accepted them. In this environment, in this therapeutic environment, as a humanistic therapist, I'm going to help you to understand that you are a person of value anyway, and that you need to be real and you need to be genuine in order to be happy with yourself, regardless of the masks that the world would have you put on to be acceptable. That kind of approach that involves listening and validating and accepting and modeling authenticity is a big part of therapy today. And so that's a big application of humanistic psychology. But there's not a whole lot of other applications except for perhaps something called positive psychology, which does emphasize human potential and creativity and the positive things that humans do, as opposed to the emphasis that a lot of times psychology has, which is the mistakes we make and the mental illnesses that we can experience, and so on. All right. The fourth paradigm of psychology is actually the first one that came up in the history of psychology, and that's the cognitive paradigm. So Wilhelm Wundt was a cognitive psychologist. He said that he thought that we need to study mental processes. Today, cognitive psychology is more scientific because of technology, and also because we're not just focusing on structural elements of thinking. We're studying decision making and and creativity and memory and intelligence and all the applications associated with those. And in mental health, we're studying not just the physical symptoms of a mental illness, but we're studying the cognitive processes, the thinking processes that influence that. Epicurus was a Greek philosopher way back when who said it's not things that make people sick, and in this case meaning anxious or depressed, it's people's perceptions of things. And I think that's more true today than it was back then, 2,500 years ago. So that's an application of cognitive psychology and an indication of how huge it is in psychology today. Probably the two most prominent paradigms in psychology today are the cognitive paradigm and the behavioral paradigm, and let me add to that, the biological paradigm. The three most common, largely influential paradigms in psychology are behavioral, cognitive, and biological. Now, the biological paradigm says, you know what, okay, all this other stuff is important, but ultimately everything can be reduced down to neurotransmitters and hormones and all that biochemistry that's going on in our system. And you know, they're absolutely right. I'm a social psychologist, and so that means I'm probably more aligned with cognitive and behavioral psychology because I prefer to study that. I think that's the most interesting part of psychology. But I have to admit, I do acknowledge that everything that we study this semester can be reduced to the stuff that's in Chapter 2, the biological bases for everything. And so it's a huge paradigm today. One of the biggest applications, kind of suggesting its importance, is in mental health, where if you go down and you get some sort of treatment from a therapist for depression or anxiety today, yeah, you're likely to get some sort of humanistic, cognitive, behavioral type therapy. But if it's severe, you're also likely to be given the option of a medication. And if it's really severe, maybe doctors and people around you are going to say, take the medication, please. It's a huge part of psychology, mental illness today, for better or for worse. It does help a lot of people. That's the good side. It also doesn't help some people, and there are other issues associated with medications, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Anyway, 5 major paradigms of psychology. Those are the ones that you need to know about for the test. Structuralism, functionalism, I wouldn't worry too much about. And the other paradigms that are mentioned in the book, read about them in the book, but I'm not going to test you on them. Now, if you're a science, you're going to have goals. So psychology is a discipline like many others that has 4 basic goals: to describe, predict, explain, and control. So you can look at these as what, when, why, and how questions. What are the characteristics of schizophrenia, for instance? When do people become schizophrenic? Why do people become schizophrenic? And how can we intervene to help people who are schizophrenic? That's what control means. We could make a case that the most basic goal in psychology, or any discipline for that matter, is to describe. So that's the first goal. The last goal, or the ultimate goal, the one that's the hardest to do, that is really dependent upon all the other goals, is control. Manipulate, intervene to improve. Now, while most people would agree that 1 and 4 on that list are in their proper place, there's an argument a little bit about the middle 2. Is it really in fact the case that prediction comes before explanation, that it's easier to predict things than to explain them? Now, if you believe that this order is the correct one, then when I first started teaching, and To Kill a Mockingbird was a common movie still played for 7th and 8th grade students in junior high, noting that Gregory Peck was Atticus Finch in the movie To Kill a Mockingbird. This was the mnemonic that I used to help students to remember DPEC, describe, predict, explain, control, that order. D. Peck, D. Gregory Peck. Now, some people think that actually it's the other way around. Some people think that it's easier to explain than predict. First of all, you explain something, and then that allows you to be able to predict it. And if you believe that, then you use Johnny Depp C, DEPC. Either way works as long as you remember that the 4 goals of psychology are describe, predict, explain, control. And you should know that the D and the C are at the beginning and the end, and P and E are, either one's first or the other one's first. Now, in order to fulfill those goals of psychology, to answer the questions that we ask, we engage in the scientific method. Now, as I said, we use systematic processes, systematic observations to test hypotheses. Now, you can read in the book about surveys, case studies, clinical interviews, naturalistic observations, archival studies, and experiments. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the first 5. Each one of those, other than to say this, each one of these is a method of... All right, so some technical difficulty, sorry about that. So each one of these is a way of testing hypotheses. The first 5, well, all of them have their faults. If you do them incorrectly, if you are not careful, if you try to apply them in ways that you shouldn't apply them, then they can lead to erroneous conclusions. And so that's true about any of these methods. But they all can be used to gather information scientifically and to come at real truths. Now, what I really want to do is contrast the first 5 types of methods of psychological science with the last one. So in other words, we're going to contrast non-experiments with experiments. And here's the contrast. The major fact I want you to know about the first 5 types of data gathering techniques and ways of collecting, testing hypotheses. The first 5 allow us to describe and predict. They allow us to understand that variables are correlated with each other, but they're not able to help us understand really if there's a cause and effect relationship between, say, variable A and variable B. So we may be able to determine that variable A and B are related to each other in some way through surveys and case studies and archival studies and interviews and whatnot, but it's much harder through those methods to find out if A causes B. So in order to find out if something causes something else, we need to do experiments. Now let me give you some examples of that idea. So this goes back many years, and I know you can't see this on this screen, but while you're looking at the PowerPoint, maybe simultaneously, you could read the fine print. This is the back of a cereal box that I was reading as I was eating Kellogg's Frosted Mini Wheats for breakfast many years ago. And I noted it on the back of the cereal box, it said this: kids who eat breakfast perform better in school. Now, if you read the fine print, it says, in fact, studies from around the world show that kids who eat breakfast perform better during their morning school hours. So, as a person who understands that you can't really put something like that in an advertisement if it wasn't true, I'm believing that they probably have research, they probably have data that suggests that this is indeed true, that kids who eat breakfast perform better in school in their early morning hours. But as a researcher, and knowing the difference between non-experiments and experiments, and assuming that the kind of data and research that they did is probably not experimental, I'm asking the further question, is it really the case that eating breakfast causes kids to do better in the early morning hours? Is breakfast the cause, or is something else the cause? You wouldn't really know unless you did an experiment. All right, I think without getting into that too much, I think maybe you can think about some possible relationships between breakfast and performance in school and a bunch of other variables that may suggest that those other variables may be more important than eating breakfast. For instance, like this: if you are a child at home and your parents encourage you to eat breakfast before going to school because maybe your parents believe that that's going to help you do better in school, they probably also are doing other things that help you to do better in school, such as helping you with your homework, spending time with you before you go to bed, maybe reviewing what you learned that day, showing interest in you, encouraging you to do well in school, all those things, and a bunch of other things that we could throw in there as well that may be the real reasons why these kids are doing better in school, not the breakfast itself. And yet, if you just do surveys, a non-experimental type study, you could find a correlation between eating breakfast and doing better in school, and that may lead you to assume that eating breakfast is the cause of the better performance, when really, if you did an experiment, you find out the breakfast is not that important. Now, it is important, but maybe not as important as some other things. The real cause here of doing better in school is something else. So, just an example of the difference between correlation and causation, the difference between cause and effect conclusions and correlational conclusions. Now, I want to give you some other examples of the possibility or the tendency that we have to confuse correlation with causation. Many years ago, not many, maybe let's say 5 or 6, one of my daughters posted on her Facebook page an article, and the article had to do something with the correlation that some researchers found between daughters who have high career aspirations and tend to go further with their college education, and who also have, so correlation between that and having fathers who did a lot of household chores when these daughters were at home. So my daughter posted this article and she said, "Thanks, Dad," so that everybody could see, all of her friends and all of my friends as well that are joint. All of them could see that I was a good father. She was praising me and saying, "Thanks, Dad, for being the kind of father that did all those household chores when I was younger." Because of that, apparently, according to this research, that's the reason why I have the career goals and I got my bachelor's degree and all that. She eventually went on to become a school teacher. So she was praising me for that. And I thought, this is cool. Everybody knows I'm a great dad now. But that was before I started to think about it in terms of experiments and non-experiments. I began to question whether maybe me doing household chores was like eating breakfast in the morning. It's a factor, but maybe there's something else going on here. And I read about it some more, researched it a little more, and what I determined was that the real thing that's going on here is the reason why a lot of fathers are doing household chores is because their wives, the women in their lives, the kids' mothers, are working. They're outside of the home. And so somebody needs to do the laundry and cook the meals and do the dishes and all that sort of stuff. So the father's more likely to share in that because he kind of has to. So if you really analyze it, you realize maybe the reason why these daughters have higher career aspirations is not because the fathers did the household chores. It's because the mothers have those goals themselves. They're modeling it. The daughters are saying, "I can do that too." And so that was when I realized I got to stop patting myself on the back. And my daughter, Anna Marie, you need to stop patting myself on the back. You need to start patting your mom on the back, because she's the one that maybe you should give the credit to. But another area where we can confuse correlation and causation if we don't do the right studies. Now, this is the classical example. Back when I first started teaching, many parents were having their kids listen to classical music several hours over the course of a week or a month because they believed that classical music listening would lead to increased intelligence or higher scores on IQ tests. And there was data that supported that, but it was correlational data. In response to the correlational data, a governor in a southern state went on TV and called out his state legislature and said, "Now we know," we don't really know that, but he believed we know, that classical music listening causes increased intelligence. And so let's forget all this other stuff that we've been trying to do for years to increase our kids' intelligence in the school system. Let's mandate or force the kids X number of hours of classical music listening each week. So go start passing laws to make this happen. And if you think about it, that's quite a major mandate to give the legislature, quite a major change in the educational system, all based on correlational research, non-experimental data that said that there's a correlation, not cause and effect. If you do the experiment, what do you find out? Well, since then, actually, we've done the experiments. And what they show is it's not classical music listening that's most important in causing increased intelligence. It's the thing that underlies it that classical music tends to correlate with. So parents who play classical music to their kids are more likely to read to them at night before they go to bed. They're more likely to encourage education, more likely to listen to them, engage them in conversation, to challenge them, their thinking, and all those things, and provide maybe computers and other books and all sorts of things that help them to become smarter and do better in school. So that makes classical music correlated with increased intelligence, but the real thing that's driving it is not the music, it's the quality of the environment that these kids are raised in. Now, the last example is a more recent one. I saw this in the media a couple of years ago. There is a correlation, according to the research, between mental illness and drug abuse. So people who abuse drugs are more likely to become mentally ill. So that has led some people to assume, making the mistake that correlation leads to causation and not understanding the difference between non-experiments and experiments. That has led some people to assume that drug abuse causes mental illness. And you know what? That's a possibility, but many people believe that it's likely true the other way around as well. And that is that people who are mentally ill, maybe with an undiagnosed mental illness, with something wrong inside of them that makes them uncomfortable, makes them sort of distressed or anxious or in a negative state of mind, that's what is causing them to abuse drugs. And I actually firmly believe that many drug abusers start abusing drugs because of self-medication. They're trying to fix a problem that they haven't been able to fix otherwise. It doesn't seem to be going away. And so they just find something that works for them on the street. So here's a issue where when you do the research, you might find that, okay, maybe A causes B. Drug abuse causes mental illness in some cases, but maybe in other cases, the mental illness causes the drug abuse. And then maybe there's a whole other set of variables underneath that underlie them both. If you do the experiments, you would be able to determine the nature of the relationships all the way around. If you do surveys and case studies and archival studies, you're not going to be able to determine the direction of influence and what's cause and effect. Now, I just stated this, but let me just show it to you through a diagram. Anytime there's a relationship between two variables, let's say drug abuse and mental illness, smoking and cancer, listening to classical music and having increased intelligence and things like that, it's possible at first glance, just looking at it, it's theoretically possible that the first variable causes the second one, but it's also possible that the second variable causes the first one. So there are two possible arrow directions there. And when you do a survey, you're not able to address which arrow is the correct one. But there's another set of variables that in most cases could also be important here. There may be what's called the third variable problem, another variable or set of variables that underlie them both. Again, if you do a non-experiment, you can't determine which set of arrows are the correct ones. But in an experiment, you can. And the way you do it is by isolating variable B against A while controlling all of the variable C's so that they can't have an effect. So that if there was a change in variable B when you manipulated variable A, then A must have been the cause of B while you're controlling C. If you controlled C, eliminate it as possible influence on all the B outcome, then the cause of B's change must have come from A. So that's what you do in an experiment. Now, again, let's go back to the classical music example. There actually is some evidence that suggested early on that listening to classical music resonates in the brain in some positive way, and it helps our thinking and may help increase our intellectual processes or benefit them in a positive way. So that led to the conclusion early on that maybe A does cause B in this case. But maybe it's also the case that being more intelligent it leads you to listen to classical music more so than other types of music, which I won't mention to not step on any toes right now. But, maybe your mindset, your intellectual processing ability influences the kind of music you listen to. That's kind of not a very difficult statement to believe as being true. So here again, you have the possibility that B causes A, not just that A causes B. And then there's the possibility, as I mentioned before, that if you're raised in an environment where your educational endeavors are encouraged and all sorts of tools are given you to be more intelligent, part of that whole environment may involve listening to classical music as opposed to other types of classical music. So that leads to kind of an artificial association between A and B, but the real cause going on here is from C. It's the quality of environment that's causing them both. Now, we can do an experiment on this, and what they actually have done is they manipulate the amount of classical music kids have listened to, and they control for what's happening at the home and other things like diet and health and socioeconomic status. Well, they control for all those other things and just manipulate classical music listening and see what effect that manipulation has on intelligence. What they've determined is that there's very little effect of classical music listening on intelligence when you control for these other things, which kind of, particularly after the fact, has led that governor of whatever southern state it was to kind of feel hopefully a little embarrassed that he went to the state legislature asking for a mandate for X number of classical music listening per week in the school system. We don't want to jump to conclusions based on we don't want to jump to conclusions about cause and effect relationships based on non-experimental data. Now, that's all examples helping you to understand the concepts. Let's take a look at the testable concepts here, testable kind of facts. Variable A in these examples we would call the independent variable in an experiment. Now, non-experiments don't have independent variables. Independent variables are the thing that you manipulate in a study to see if it is the cause that you think it is. Variable B's are called dependent variables. This label makes the most sense to me because the outcome, dependent variable is the outcome or the effect, and so it depends. What happens there depends on your manipulation. All the other variables that could influence the outcome, we want to get rid of and eliminate their effects so that we can take a clean look at the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. So we control these. We control for them through random assignment as described in the book. When we're doing the experiment and assigning people to be in the 5-hour-a-week classical music listening group versus the 2-hour-a-week versus 2-hour-a-week group versus the 0-hour-a-week listening group. We're going to assign people to those groups randomly. We call that random assignment. That's a very important method of controlling extraneous variables. We control other extraneous variables by making sure that other than the manipulation in the study, the other procedures of the study are the same. And sometimes we sample to make sure that everybody in the study is in sort of like the mid-ranges of a particular variable. We throw out all the subjects that are extremely intelligent or the ones that are extremely unintelligent or the ones that are extremely unhealthy. And we pull out the ones that have other sorts of issues going on that may be problematic and messing up the results. So we're only going to look at situations in where we could get a cleaner look at just the independent variable against the dependent variable. There's a lot of ways that we can control for extraneous variables, but the point is we do the best we can in each experiment to get a clean look at the IV against the DV. Now, basically, if we do that, if we control extraneous variables while manipulating the independent variable to see if it has an effect on the dependent variable, we're able to determine cause and effect. That's why experiments allow us to determine cause and effect. Now, back when I was in grad school, I had a lot of fellow students that liked to pull all-nighters before taking a big test in the morning. And I always thought that was kind of self-sabotage, that sleep is important. And all the research in the last 40 years or so since I've been out of school has suggested that that is indeed the case. Sleep is more important than the 8 hours that you would study, assuming that you're studying ahead of the sleep and preparing ahead of time adequately. Getting that good night's sleep before the test is probably going to help you more than studying that night before the test. Anyway, I use that as an example to point out how you could do an experiment on sleep and test performance. So think about how you would set that up, and what would be the independent variable, and what would be the dependent variable, and what would be some important extraneous variables that you would want to control for. Well, the independent variable that you think is the cause of some outcome that you want to see if it actually is the cause you think it is amount of sleep. So you're going to assign some students to sleep 8 hours, some 6, some 4, some 2, some none. The dependent variable is the outcome. That's test performance. Other things that can influence test performance, extraneous variables that you want to control for, would be test taking ability. Some are better test takers than others. So maybe you give all your possible subjects a pre-test and determine which students are in kind of the moderate ranges of test taking ability and only test them. You want to make sure they're all taking the same test. They've all had the same amount of study time ahead of time. You make sure that their intelligence is roughly the same, in the same broad middle ranges. You want to make sure that all of your subjects are mentally healthy. You want to make sure that prior to taking the test in the morning, they've all had the same breakfast. Some can't have a breakfast and others not have a breakfast. They have to be the same in every variable that could affect the outcome, except for the amount of sleep that they got. And if those who got more sleep did better on the test when all these other variables are equated in a sense or eliminated, then you know that sleep matters, that the independent variable has a cause and effect relationship on the dependent variable of sleep. Now, another example would be you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You might get young dogs, middle-aged dogs, old dogs, teach them a bunch of tricks and see if they can recall those or how well they can recall those a day or two later. So the independent variable here would be age, right? It's the thing that you think is the cause of the outcome. Age. The outcome would be their performance on the tricks. So that would be the dependent variable. Extraneous variables would be the breed of the dog, the health of the dog, and other things that I guess we won't go into at this point. But what I want to point out here is that age is an interesting independent variable. Technically, it's not an independent variable, and technically, this is not an experiment, because in an experiment, you have to specifically manipulate it. You can't assign people, you can't assign age to dogs. You can't say, you're going to be in the old dog group, you're going to be in the middle-aged dog group, you're going to be in the young-aged dog group. They are or they aren't. So you have to sample for age. When you sample for age, then you haven't manipulated your independent variable, and it's not a true experiment. Similarly, when you make the conclusion that smoking is a likely cause of lung cancer, in order to do that clearly and definitively, to show clearly that smoking is a cause of lung cancer, which basically means that you're increasing your risk of lung cancer the more you smoke, what you'd have to do is you'd have to assign people to the 2-pack-a-day group, assign other people to the 1-pack-a-day group, another group of people to the 0-pack-a-day group, while equating other variables that can influence lung cancer. But we don't do that. We can't do that. It wouldn't be ethical. So what we have is a quasi-experiment here, a non-experiment, one in which we haven't truly manipulated smoking, which basically means that we haven't proven definitively that smoking causes cancer, because we haven't done the experiments. Now, we've done experiments on animals, we've done experiments in petri dishes, but not with humans, because it's not ethical. So that allows some people to say we haven't proven that smoking causes cancer, and I would say that's technically true. But the truth is that we can do enough non-experiments, enough quasi-experiments to show that it is pretty much likely a cause or a risk factor in lung cancer. But I just want to point out that there's many non-experiments that we're relegated to doing because we can't do the experiments ethically or practically. In those cases, we just do the best we can. Now, let's talk about the subfields of psychology. Psychology is a very vast science with many, many sub-disciplines, subspecialties. What I want to point out here primarily is that the right side of the pie corresponds with a lot of the chapters of our book. They correspond with many of the research-oriented academic fields of psychology. The left side of the pie, I'm saying that wrong. The right side of the pie is the practical clinical counseling side of psychology. The left side of the pie is the academic, more research-oriented side of psychology. There's actually a trade organization called the APA, the American Psychological Association, that is the trade association for the right side of the pie. The left side of the pie has complained that, look, your side of the pie is not all that scientific, and you really don't know a whole lot about the true world, the truth, because you're just dealing with clients and not doing who are mentally ill and not really doing a lot of scientific research. So we need our own trade association, and this was back like 30 years ago. They created the APS, Association for Psychological Science, as their trade association. They criticize those on the right side of the pie for not being scientific. People on the right side of the pie can criticize people on the left side for not really knowing the real world, because they live in the ivory tower of academia. They spend all their time in artificial labs doing artificial experiments that are not really indicative of the real world. And of course, that debate kind of goes on, and there's a little bit of truth on both sides. But I just want to point out that at some point in psychology, you kind of have to understand and figure out whether you are a right side of the pie thinker or a left side of the pie thinker. Are you a more academic, researcher, scientific type thinker in the field of psychology? If so, you're probably more likely to go into developmental, personality, social, cognitive, industrial, biological, experimental psychology, or something like that. If you're a want to save the world kind of a thinker, a practical person who wants to really intervene in people's lives and in a positive way, and you don't really care about all that scientific academic research, then you go into clinical or counseling psychology. So again, like I mentioned at the outset, half of all psychologists are trained as therapists, and the rest of us are trained to do research and teach. Actually, more people teach and do research in psychology and work in those kind of settings than in any other type of setting in psychology. So that's kind of what this slide depicts. It's a little bit hard to read, but there is this large group of people who are in private practice doing therapy, and some of them are doing business or using mental health in corporations or in the business world in some way. That's a large piece of the pie in terms of where people work. This is employment settings. But there's a large piece of the pie that depicts that people work in colleges. These are psychologists who work in colleges. Then there's also this other education field. If you add this piece of the pie with that one, you can see that more psychologists actually work in educational settings than any place else. And that would include me. Now, let's talk about right side of the pie psychologists, those who want to save the world and intervene in some people's lives in a positive way. I'm going to give you a list of the types of therapist titles that you can be educated for and receive degrees in and receive licenses for to be able to practice therapy. And I'm going to put them in kind of a pyramid hierarchical format arrangement so that you can see who's at the top of the pyramid, who makes the most money, who has the most clout, and those would be psychiatrists. Interesting thing about this is that psychiatrists are not typically psychologists. They may never have really taken psychology classes in college or majored in psychology. Somewhere early on, they may have decided they wanted to become a doctor. Why? Because you can make a lot of money, and medical doctors are highly respected, and maybe they just like the idea of dealing with people's biology and all that sort of stuff. Maybe that's what interests them. So they go into college taking some GE classes, but eventually they take a lot of chemistry and anatomy and physiology and biology and zoology. And then they go and get into med school, and they take more of the same, and they do their rotations, and they go through all these different disciplines. And somewhere in there, they get the rotation in psychiatry, and so they get that training. And then they do an internship or residency, and then they get really their primary psychiatric training in this residency. become medical doctors practicing therapy, but really never having taken a psychology class like a psych major or a set of psychology classes like psych majors might at ARC, UC Davis, Sac State, or wherever you go. Now, the other thing I want to point out about psychiatrists is because they're medical doctors, they can prescribe medicine. Because they can prescribe medicine, they tend to see what I would call the hardcore mentally ill, the ones with the worst kinds of mental illnesses that tend to need medication. So these would be the hardcore mentally ill, I would say, are severely depressed, severely anxious, schizophrenics, severely anxious people. And then other people as well, depending upon severity, but these are the people that psychiatrists tend to treat. And mostly, if you were to ask a psychiatrist what they do in a typical day today, mostly what they would say is they prescribe medications, they consult with people and other doctors to help mentally ill patients get their medications. They basically spend most of their time centered on medications. They don't do a lot of therapy. Now, psychiatrists can do therapy because they have that training in their residency. And maybe because they want to, they prefer to do therapy, and maybe they're decent at it, so people tend to go to them, and so they develop a clientele. But for the most part, psychiatrists don't do a lot of therapy today because our system kind of demands that they're needed for non-therapeutic purposes. They're needed for prescription medication. Next on the list is clinical psychologists. They're the first people on the list that are true psychologists. They're PhDs. They can't prescribe drugs. They tend to treat the same people as psychiatrists do, the hardcore mentally ill. In fact, some people have two therapists, the one that gives them medication, psychiatrist, and the one that gives them therapy. So clinical psychologists are therefore more likely to do therapy than psychiatrists. They also do a lot of diagnosis. They can do research. Underneath, actually, the joke is, what's the real difference between a psychiatrist and a clinical psychologist? The answer is about $50 an hour. And I don't know whether that's really true or not, but it really is true in general that if you were to go get a treatment from a psychiatrist in Sacramento today, you might pay $350, or the insurance company might be charged $350 an hour. And the clinical psychologist may charge $300 or $275 or something like that. Counseling psychologists also have PhDs. They tend to see the less hardcore mentally ill, the ones with more everyday mental illness issues, moderate to mild depression and anxiety, adjustment issues, relationship issues, family issues. They're probably best trained in therapy because their education is less concerned with diagnosis and research and more on just intervention techniques. Then you have counselors who have master's degrees. Now, what I've indicated here is the MFT license. Everybody who practices therapy needs to have a license. You have a certain number of mentored, supervised hours and you have to take the test. And then you get licensed to be a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist or a counseling psychologist. But counselors without PhDs or MDs typically get the MFT license. It stands for Marriage Family Therapist. As you can tell, or as that name suggests, these people are also seeing the less hardcore mentally ill, the people with more everyday problems. The most common license for practicing psychology in the state of California is the MFT license. And you have social workers, I put them way down here, but they could be at the top because they could become psychiatric social workers. They could get the licensing and the training to become psychiatric social workers. They could be clinical social workers. They could have PhDs. They could have master's degrees. In general, though, social workers don't sit down and do a lot of individual therapy. Their view is that it's not the person that's the real problem here that needs to be fixed. It's the person's interface with society and other people. And so social workers kind of work. They often work as case managers. They work with patients to put them in touch with employment agencies and counselors and maybe other counselors and drug abuse counselors and family support systems to make sure that they get whatever they need. They do group therapy. They don't do as much individual therapy. They can, again, make more money or less money depending on whether they're treating people that are more likely to need medications and more likely to hardcore mentally ill. And the truth is, when you come right down to it, then it is that whatever your license is, you can charge whatever people will pay you. And so you could have social workers that charge a lot of money and psychiatrists that don't charge a whole lot. But you tend to make less money, and the amount of money you'll pay for any one of these types of therapies is less as you go down the pyramid. Now there's also, last on the list, there's certificated personnel. At ARC, we have a chemical abuse, we have a human services program that can train people to become chemical abuse counselors and take the licensing exam and go through the procedures to become a drug abuse counselor. Many of these people end up with just a 2-year degree certificate, some with bachelor's degrees. These are the people that are working, whether it's drug abuse or with the elderly or some other special population. These are the people who are working on the ground level more so than other people. They tend to require the least amount of education, and they tend to get paid the least amount of money. We need these people. It's a little bit like being a 7th grade teacher. I could never do that. I could never be a preschool teacher, but we need good people to do those things. Same thing here. We need good certificated personnel. Unfortunately, though, there's not a lot of upward mobility here with people at the lower rungs of this therapy kind of hierarchy here, pyramid. All right, you know what? That's the chapter. I hope that worked out for you. I hope that was interesting and informative. Remember the book. There's a lot of things in the book that you're going to need to fill in the gaps that I've left here through this lecture. Also, the study questions that I have in the book, in Canvas. Again, it's the second item in each chapter module. I have the PowerPoint first, and then I have the chapter study questions. Use those as a guide for what you really need to study when you take the quizzes and the tests. Now, I think you should read entire chapter, get a familiarity of everything, but when you actually sit down to study the material that you want to retain for quizzes and tests, just study the material related to those chapter study questions. All right, I'll see you next week or next time.